So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Tenant Tuesdays at 2. I am Kitty Morris. I'm an attorney here at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia, and we are here again today. We did take a break last week because of everything that was happening, but we're back today for another tenant-facing discussion about issues that are happening in and around the city of Philadelphia, and we hope that you join us every week. This week, we are we're going to go over a lot of things that we've talked about previously. I know last week was the first of the month, so we're going to give a refresher on some of the advice that we generally give to tenants at the beginning of the month. And we're also going to talk briefly about some exciting things that have happened in Philadelphia City Council. So as usual, if you need personalized advice, you can visit www.phillytenant.org, or you can call our hotline at 267-443-2500. Spanish interpretation services are available live through Zoom, or the video will be available in Spanish later on YouTube. Today, I'm joined by Vikram Patel, who's an attorney here in our housing unit, become quite a bit of an expert in city council advocacy and the bills that we're going to talk about briefly today. So we're happy to have you here today, Vikram, and hopefully you can shed some light for us on things that have happened recently at the city level. So tell us about what's happened in the last week in the city. I know we've seen the protests, we've seen the unrest, we've seen the calls for change. And while that was happening simultaneously, there was also some great moves by city council to protect homeowners and vulnerable populations. So what happened?
Yeah, so last week, the housing committee in the city council heard 6 bills. These were introduced by council members Gauthier, Gim, and Brooks, and this was on Friday. This was sort of a continuation of the previous week. So the previous week, the housing committee heard a long day of testimony. Now this day on Friday last week, it was a bit of a truncated day. It was a bit of a shortened day, but they did end up voting on these 6 bills, and 5 of these bills, after some amendments throughout the week, ended up passing unanimously. The sixth bill, I'll go through each of the bills in just a second, but yeah, the 6th bill was regarding rent stabilization. And unfortunately, that did not pass. But the 5 bills that did pass are one, a eviction moratorium, extension of the, currently have an eviction moratorium through, the 10th, July 10th. But this would, create a Philadelphia citywide eviction moratorium through August 31st. So there's eviction moratorium. There's a diversion program, which is a program where, if you're behind on your rent, you've been affected by COVID, instead of going directly to court, it creates a program where you can sort of mediate with your landlord up to 1 month ahead of going to court. And then we have a bill that deals with illegal lockouts. This is a bill that sort of expands the consequences to a landlord for illegally locking out a tenant. So it's been quite a while, that since landlords have had access to the courts in order to evict tenants. So one thing that we've seen, right, is, and this happens even when we're not in a pandemic, but one thing we've seen a bit of an uptick in is tenants going through and illegally locking out a tenant. Now I figure probably later on we'll talk about what it means to illegally lock out a tenant. But yeah, this is a bill that would increase the penalties for that. Then we have a payment agreements bill. Essentially, right, it's, a lot of us in Philadelphia, a lot of Philadelphians are out of work, haven't been able to pay rent. And, a lot of Philadelphians also struggle with, even meeting their regular bills before this. So this bill would create, up to 9 months of a payment program where, landlord and tenant could agree to, give the tenant a significant period where the tenant can pay off back rent. And then we have late fee waiver. So, we've seen late fee waivers in some other bills that have been passed, on the federal level, which we're going to be talking about the CARES Act a little bit later. But that's one of the bills that we've seen that waive late fees for rent, because a lot of people, once again, in Philadelphia, are struggling with being able to pay their rent right now, and late fees, that rack up, would essentially create, for a lot of Philadelphians, a hole that's impossible to climb out of. And so the last bill that also passed out of the Housing Committee is a bill that would waive late fees for people who are affected by COVID and were unable to pay their rent during this time. Now, these 5 bills that passed out of committee, they're going to be heard again by the whole committee, not just the Housing Committee, but it's now going to the whole committee. We're getting close to these bills passing. So on Thursday, they're going to go through what's called first reading, which is the first time the whole city council gets to see the amended bills and talk about them as a whole city council. And then there's the possibility that the week after that, it goes to second reading and maybe passage. So
this is the point where we would encourage individuals, and I know there's been robust participation from members of the public both in giving testimony and in reaching out to their various city council members to engage with them around these various pieces of legislation. So we would encourage individuals, particularly tenants throughout Philadelphia who may have been affected by COVID, either through underemployment or lack of employment, to reach out to your city council members and let them know how important these protections are to you as they move forward to a full vote. Like, nothing is guaranteed yet. The first stage, as you mentioned, out of committee has just happened, and now they're going to the first reading where it's possible that more amendments may show up. There are different interests at work right now, so we encourage the citizens of Philadelphia to make their voice heard and show their support for these pieces of legislation as they move their way through city council.
Yeah, I think one of the things I think is most important for us to highlight is that the tenants in Philadelphia, the tenants that call the hotline that we often hear, they're not calling because they want to get out of paying rent. A lot of tenants, want to pay rent. It's just that they need time, they need space, they need the time to apply for programs that haven't even been set up yet. Many of our clients, right, haven't even though they've applied weeks ago, still haven't received unemployment. So I think it's really important to press upon the members of city council that what these bills create is the time and space for Philadelphians to get back on their feet and for Philadelphia to recover from this crisis.
I couldn't agree more. And I think as we shift our conversation to the courts, it becomes more important for us to focus on why these bills are necessary. I think we realize, as you said, Philadelphia's judicial emergency goes through July 10th, at which point the courts could open again and begin accepting new filings. Individuals who had previously been facing evictions could be brought back to court at this point in time. And the economy still has not recovered. We've just moved to the yellow zone where it's no longer stay at home, but safer at home. And individuals are still trying to get back on their feet. And I can imagine if you've been living paycheck to paycheck and you've been out of work for a month or 2 months, that's a significant burden that you are facing as you try to catch up. So you might have the willingness to pay your landlord, but not the space or ability to request a payment arrangement. So I think these bills do go a very long way in creating that space for tenants and also creating an incentive for everyone to come together to the table and negotiate. So I think these are very important pieces of legislation that we should encourage everyone to really reach out on and make their voices heard. So Vikram, I kind of want to shift the conversation with you to what the typical eviction process looks like. I know we're talking about bills that slow down that process theoretically, but for someone who's not as familiar with what an eviction may look like, how does that begin? What should tenants really be on the lookout for now if they're behind on their rent and they feel as if they may be facing an eviction in the coming months?
Yeah. So, as the courts begin to open up again, we're still going to see quite a long period between when you're say at the present moment behind on rent and the possibility of getting locked out. So once the courts reopen, the first step is for your landlord to provide you with notice. Now this has to be a written notice. Can't be just your landlord showing up, telling you to get out. Can't be just giving you a phone call. First step is for you to receive a written notice from your landlord that they intend on filing for an eviction in court, which is the next step. So next, you'll have a hearing scheduled. You should receive notice. Now, sometimes these notices can get lost in the mail. Sometimes maybe they go to the wrong address. So if you have received an eviction notice, it'd be good to reach out to an organization like ours, or any of the other organizations that are that you can reach through the Philly Tenant Hotline, which you can reach at 267-443-2500. So once a hearing is scheduled, there are a few things that can happen at that hearing. So there's generally a bit of time beforehand to sort of negotiate with landlord's attorney. Most landlords are represented by an attorney. So there's a little time to negotiate, and you may work out an agreement, and then have a judgment by agreement, where essentially you and the landlord agree to certain items. Say for example, you agree to part ways. Landlord keeps the security deposit, and you move out by a certain date, or you work out, say, a payment plan where back rent is paid over a certain period of time. Other possibility is that it goes in front of the judge. The two sides argue, and then the judge rules on the case.
I think here.
Go ahead.
Sorry to cut you off.
No.
I think here is a good time to mention for folks who may have experienced eviction court previously that conversations are afoot as to how to properly have the court process happen in the midst of COVID-19 to create a safe environment, really, so that no one runs the risk of getting COVID from just being forced to come and engage in that process. So to the extent that you receive a notice, you should at least contact the court to see if your case has been scheduled, because there might be very specific time slots allocated to cases as a means of crowd control and reducing the risk of cross-contamination or infection, whatever the proper medical term for that is. So it's important that people act proactively in this context to both ensure their health and safety and make sure that they're not showing up to court at the wrong time slot, because all of the cases, I think, will be assigned time slot, at least in the coming months, as we negotiate through hopefully what will be a post-COVID-19 space without trying to create COVID-19 again. And I think, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, just to expand a little bit on that. I think a few key items to remember with regard to just this COVID-19 situation and how it relates to the courts are one, if you do end up having a hearing in court, you're going to be required to wear a mask, and that may not be provided. Actually, very likely will not be provided at court. And court has said that if you show up without a mask, you may have a default judgment, which means that you automatically essentially lose the case, and then have to go through a whole nother process if you want to reopen the case or appeal the case. But it's time intensive. So one, show up with a mask. Two, show up early. It's hard. Of course, you have to take off time to go to court, take off time from work, find childcare. It is time consuming, but the court is limiting the number of people that can say go in the elevator, or they have several check-in points. So if you've been to landlord-tenant court before, expect for it to take longer for you to get to the courtroom. So show up early and have a mask. Otherwise, they might end up entering a default judgment before you even get to the courtroom.
I think that's very important advice. And as we think about who can be evicted, right now there's a governor's order in place that basically protects individuals who would generally be evicted on the basis of non-payment of rent or termination of your lease term, which is that you get to the end of your lease and your landlord does not want to renew your lease. And maybe you want to leave, but you can't leave because we're in the midst of a pandemic. I know there's at least one of the bills in City Council that will stretch out that window to give people more flexibility to negotiate departure terms or catch up on unpaid rent. So it's important that we engage the system on all points, because once July comes around and things get moving again, we want to be able to make sure that people get the maximum benefit out of the court process, because we haven't had a pandemic like this, I think, since Spanish flu, where we've really had to close things down and figure out how to operate in this new way. So it's important that these bills get passed both at the city council level and that people are proactive. And if you have a disability or if you are in a vulnerable age group, you might be, let's say, predisposed because of your medical history or just because of your age, you can contact the court and request or find out what their accommodation process is for you to participate in that hearing, because we don't want you to show up and get COVID-19 because you're predisposed, or not show up on the basis that you are afraid of getting COVID-19 and then not be able to meaningfully engage in that process. So communication is very vital at this point in time. And we're trying on all levels to make sure it's a smooth process for when we return to court, but everyone has to engage in some way, shape, or form. So Vikram, if you can answer this for me, after you show up to court, you have a hearing, let's say you go before a judge or you come to an agreement that says you have to leave, what's the minimum time window within which a person can be removed from their home?
Yeah, so it's 21 days at the absolute minimum. So there's first, landlord has to request what's called a writ of possession. Which is 10 days after the hearing, and then there's it's called an alias writ. I mean, the names of these aren't the biggest thing, but essentially, there's a couple steps that the landlord has to take before you can actually be locked out legally. And it's the absolute minimum that it takes is 21 days. And even if you've lost your, God forbid, lost your case in court, and the landlord goes and locks you out before that period, it is an illegal lockout. Anytime you get locked out before this, it's an illegal lockout, and I think we're probably going to go over just maybe a little bit later as to what to do in that context.
Yeah, we're about to switch the conversation to what to do in the context of an illegal lockout, and we're going to have that conversation in about 10 seconds. So Vikram, as we talk about illegal lockouts, I know a lot of people kind of hopefully have a sense of what that is because we've talked about it previously, but I would say just a basic definition is your landlord engaging in any acts or series of acts, either to intimidate you to leave the property or to make your property uninhabitable for you. So can you expand on that in any way and tell us what people should be on the lookout for?
Sure. So yeah, just as you said, Kadeem, like it's essentially your landlord taking some sort of step to get you to leave before they have the legal legal right from or legal order from a court allowing them to remove you from the property. So yeah, so it can be, say for example, changing the lock. We've seen cases where landlords have literally just removed the front door, thereby making it unsafe, or turning off your utilities, turning off your heat in the winter, or turning off your electricity in the summer so you can't have air conditioning or a fan. It can be just showing up and literally removing you by force. I mean, it's essentially any act that the landlord's going to take to remove you from the property before going through all of the steps that we just talked about with regard to the eviction process, from the notice to the alias writ and having landlord tenant officer actually come out and lock you out. So yeah, anything the landlord does before completing that process, like changing the locks, is an illegal lockout.
So I would say our general advice in the context of an illegal lockout is to contact the police and request assistance. We are conscious of the fact that that may not be best for everyone for various reasons, some of which have come to light more now than previously. But I think in the context of this, if you are the victim of an illegal lockout, you can call our hotline. As we said, the Philadelphia tenant hotline is 267-443-2500. And we can provide you with advice and walk you through that process. And if needs be, I think we're able to make that initial point of contact with the police department if you need that go-between to make that a smoother process. And there is a directive that's currently in place in Philadelphia that gives the police a clear outline as to how they should approach an illegal lockout. We encourage people, to the extent that it's possible, if you have a copy of your lease in your email or on your person, most of the time, I think when these intimidation tactics start, you kind of get a sense of an awareness that there's been a breakdown in your relationship between you and the landlord. And I would say that's the point in time in which you should start making sure that you have proof of residency, because as not residency in the technical term, but prove that you reside at your home, because that's one of the things that the police officer is going to need to require to verify that you live there. And the directive calls for them to show up if you're actively being locked out. So if your landlord's changing the locks or turning off your electricity or heat, that's an instance where you can call them or call us, and we'll call them on your behalf and ask them to show up to your home and give you some assistance. There's also that injunctive process that does happen where you can file an emergency injunction at the CJC, which is in Center City, the Criminal Justice Center, and you can file an injunction to be let back into your home. Hopefully, we don't have to get that far in either intervention from the Philadelphia Eviction Prevention Project or the police will result in you being restored to your home, but there's also that legal process that you can go through if you need to be restored. But the bottom line is, if your landlord does anything that is outside of if your landlord takes any steps outside of the court process to have you removed from your property, that is considered an illegal lockout. And there is a very clear process by which we can get you restored to possession. And it's either through legal intervention or through use of the police to come to your home and verify that it's your home and let you back in, but there is that process.
Yeah, there's one other actually that one other avenue that I'm pretty excited that we have someone that does this, but the Pennsylvania Attorney General, the Attorney General's office also takes complaints regarding illegal lockout, and sometimes just having someone from the Attorney General's office call your landlord, saying that they're gonna go after them for locking you out, will be effective. So that's something that we can help with, or also you can go to the Attorney General's website. There's an online form, and then there's also a phone number on the website that you can call. But once again, if you need our help, our number is 267-443-2500.
So Vikram, I want to shift the conversation back to the CARES Act, which you mentioned. I think it was kind of the first piece of legislation that created housing protections in response to COVID-19. So if you could walk us through what that bill or that piece of legislation actually does and how it protects tenants in Philadelphia.
Yeah. So the CARES Act, it's part of a very sizable bill. The CARES Act was a very large piece of legislation, very large bill that passed back in March. That at least with regard to the part that deals with renters, it created a moratorium, essentially a period of time, up until July 25th, where a landlord who has a property that has a federally backed mortgage or receives any sort of federal subsidy of any kind cannot send you an eviction notice, cannot collect late fees, and cannot file for an eviction. So once again, that's until July 25th. Now, as a tenant, it's hard to tell whether or not your landlord has a federally backed mortgage. In fact, in a lot of cases, it's impossible for a tenant to tell. So if your landlord has sent you an eviction notice or is threatening to file a case, and you want to see if there's some protections from the CARES Act. I mean, one option may not work considering how the relationship is broken down, is to talk to your landlord about that. But you can also, once again, call us, and we can see if we can find out whether or not the CARES Act applies, or also through our channels, we can talk to the landlord and see and inform them about the CARES Act protections, because if landlord is taking any of those steps, then it's a violation of federal law, which I imagine many landlords don't want to be subject to.
Yes, and for individuals throughout Philadelphia who are thinking whether or not they're protected, the covered tenancies, in addition to federally backed mortgages, are any form of subsidized housing to which there's a federal subsidy attached. So you think about public housing, Section 8, HUD multifamily housing, or project-based housing where you may not be in a Section 8 complex, but you have a voucher that you can use to go to a different place to live, or you're in a project that is only subsidized housing. Low-income, LIHTC properties are also covered. continuum of care and transitional housing for individuals who might be aging or people who are transitioning either back to society or people who may be former addicts who are now trying to find housing and get stability. All of those properties are covered, including HOPWA and home funded. Those are two very specific housing subsidies that are available in the city of Philadelphia. Those properties are all covered. So if you receive assistance in the form of like ongoing rental assistance or payment from someone else towards your housing, your property is likely covered by the CARES Act. So just have that awareness in your mind as you negotiate with your landlord or as you respond to the crisis, because we know court can be a very traumatic experience in the best of times. Court in the context of a pandemic can be even more traumatic and creates all sorts of different pressures on individuals and how they respond to maybe a threat of an eviction. Some people might choose to leave. Some people may choose not to show up to court. Some people may just shut down completely and not even read the mail that comes in. So we just want you to have that information so that you're aware that you may be protected and that you can proactively engage with your landlord, if possible, to find out if you're protected. And at some point, your landlord may not know. For the federally backed mortgages, they may not be directly aware whether or not they have a federally backed mortgage. So that's something that you should give your landlord some time to look into and hopefully respond to so that you can use that protection if it is available. So Vikram, as we talk about the CARES Act, who does it not cover? Are there any specific types of cases that don't fall under the CARES Act?
Yeah, so the CARES Act is specifically for non-payment of rent. So if you end up with like a lease violation, say for example, there are people living on the property that aren't in the lease, or there's a pet that's not on the lease, that's on the property. Essentially, yeah, if there's some reason besides the non-payment of rent, then it's fortunately not subject to the CARES Act. So be careful when in these situations to comply with your lease. Like these protections unfortunately don't extend into cases where there's a lease violation. So along those lines, I mean, with the pandemic, we have seen people sheltering in place, moving in with relatives, coming together in order to support each other. And if you're in that situation, it's better to talk about it with your landlord and have that approval, as opposed to your landlord finding out through some other means and then you ending up getting surprised with a notice. In this time, yeah, it's important to maintain communication with your landlord. That way, you don't end up in a situation where your landlord is evicting you because they didn't know someone was living on the property.
So you mentioned notice in your last statement. Does the CARES Act provide any sort of special guidance around notice to prospective tenants in the event that a landlord seeks to evict them from a covered property?
It does. Yeah, there's the CARES Act also for anyone living in a covered property. Once again, federal subsidy or federally backed mortgage. The landlord has to provide 30-day notice for an eviction. So that means once July 25th comes around, and the CARES Act protections expire. After that, any notice that you get is 30 days, which is very different than what we see for a lot of leases. Many leases may waive notice or have just a few days, maybe 10 days. So this is a significantly longer period than we see for many leases. So that's one thing to keep in mind, and for your landlord to also keep in mind, because if that notice doesn't have that 30 days in it, then it's not compliant with the CARES Act.
So I know we spoke earlier about the bills through City Council, and there's particularly an eviction moratorium bill that would essentially line up the end of the pandemic, or it actually pushes it out a little bit longer than the essential August 25th or 26th date when landlords will be able to begin an eviction against someone in a covered CARES Act property. So we're actually doing work on all fronts to remove any ambiguity or confusion that could potentially exist around when individuals are required to go back to court. So just another plug for people to engage with their city council members around these bills. So Vikram, as we wrap, I'm going to give you an opportunity to kind of just refresh our memories on the bills that are before City Council right now and how people can engage with them around advocacy on those bills.
Sure. So once again, yeah, there are 5 bills that passed out of the Housing Committee that the entire City Council is going to be hearing. One is a bill that creates an eviction diversion program, a bill dealing with waiver of late fees, so it doesn't allow landlords to collect late fees during this time. A bill concerning illegal lockouts, essentially creating more consequences for landlords who lock you out illegally. A bill dealing with payment agreements, trying to create the amount of time necessary for tenants to get back on their feet so that they can negotiate a reasonable amount of time in order to pay back any back rent. And then the eviction moratorium, which the way that the bill is currently written, currently amended, would have an eviction moratorium up until August 31st. So these bills are going to be heard on Thursday for the first time, and then hopefully the following Thursday also. But so in that time, call council members. Their phone numbers are listed on the website. You can send them messages on social media, send them emails. These are also hearings where people can testify. You can email. On the City Council's website, it has instructions about if you want to testify, how to go about doing that. I mean, the most important messages aren't from us as advocates, but from you as people who are facing these issues right now. And so, yeah, essentially, what we're calling you to do is call your members of call your council members, email them or send them messages on social media. Essentially, contact them and express the need for these bills and how these bills would help you during this recovery period from this crisis.
I couldn't agree more. And as usual, Tenant Tuesdays at 2 is sponsored by the Philadelphia Eviction Prevention Project. That is a collaborative effort between the City of Philadelphia, the Mayor's Office, City Council, Community Legal Services, Senior Law, Legal Clinic for the Disabled, Clarify, and Turn, which is the Tenants Union Rights Network. We collaboratively provide both in-person legal services and municipal court trainings for tenants on their rights and through tenant workshops, financial counseling through Clarify, and a host of other services through our partners. Currently, the Philadelphia Eviction Prevention Project is facing a 75% budget cut as a part of the mayor's process. And we would like to continue to do this really critical work on behalf of tenants throughout Philadelphia. So we encourage individuals who are contacting their city council members to advocate for continued funding of PEP. And if you have been a client or received services through the Philadelphia Eviction Prevention Project and you'd like to share your story with your city council members, we encourage you to do so at this time as we try to make sure that not only do we have these critical protections in place for Philadelphians, but we also have advocates who can help them navigate the system at this very crucial time as we begin to recover from COVID-19. So this has been another edition of Tenant Tuesdays at 2. I'm your host, Kadeem Morris, thanking you for joining us today. We were joined by Vikram Patel, an attorney here at CLS, who basically gave us a lot of information about the process happening before City Council now with the housing protection bills that are currently going through the council, and also gave us a refresher on eviction protections for vulnerable Philadelphians. We invite you to join us next week for another edition of Tenant Tuesdays at 2. We will have the Legal Clinic for the Disabled as guest panelists to walk us through the services that they are providing to clients in the midst of the pandemic, and also services that they generally provide and how they can help you if you are a vulnerable person in Philadelphia at this point in time. So we encourage you to join us next week, and thank you for being a part of this live presentation. Bye.